Eoghan Daltun, thank you so much for joining us and during COP27 and being part of the Climate Nature Summit. Really, really, really lovely to have you here. So first question for you is, a lot of students and probably teachers wouldn't realize that Ireland actually has a rainforest. So can you tell us what actually makes a rainforest?
Sure, I'd be happy to. I'd like to say thank you very much for having me on. You know, it's a great privilege and honor to be invited to talk to you. So very briefly, what makes a rainforest is one very simple word that that tells you whether you're in a rainforest or not, and it's a bit of a tricky word maybe for some people, but it's important. I can't leave it out. It's epiphytes. So what is an epiphyte? An epiphyte is a plant that grows on trees, and there's lots of different types of epiphytes. It's really any kind of a plant that grows on a tree without being rooted in the ground. So ivy, for example, is not an epiphyte because while it grows up a tree, it's not. It's rooted in the ground. So the kind of things that are epiphytes, they're often things like mosses and ferns, but also other plants, flowering plants, and so on. And you'll see them growing on trunks and branches and so on. And they can only survive because they're not rooted in the ground. They can only survive in places in forests that get very high levels of rainfall. But also, even more importantly, that rainfall arrives on a very frequent basis. So, and it's not just rainfall is perhaps the wrong word, because it also includes, when I should probably really say precipitation, because it includes things like mist and fog and drizzle, or any kind of water that falls from the sky essentially will work, so long as it comes often enough and in large enough amounts. So if whether you're in the Amazon or the Congo or Indonesia or West Cork, you'll know you're in a rainforest if you look up, and on the branches of the trees, they'll be draped with mosses and ferns and all sorts of other plants growing on the trees. So that's how you know whether you're a rainforest or not.
So were you listening? How do you know when you're standing in a rainforest? Eoghan just told us you'll see lots of epiphytes. So which one of these is an epiphyte? The one on the left or the one on the right? Shout out the answer. You've got 3 seconds. Very good. Okay, so I hope you managed to get that. It's the one on the left. It's a fern. So can you explain why that's an epiphyte and the ivy wasn't an epiphyte? You've got 10 seconds for this. Talk to the person beside you. I hope you got it. So the reason this is an epiphyte is because it's actually growing on the branch of a tree. If something has its roots in the soil and it grows up the tree, it can't be an epiphyte. Epiphytes don't have their roots in a soil. They can grow on trees because of the moist conditions in the rainforest. Well done.
So if you were to get in a time machine and go back to go back several thousand years, most of the west coast of Ireland and other parts of our island that get very high levels of rain and other types of moisture, they would have been covered in rainforests. Now, what happened to that rainforest? Well, the main thing that happened really was that farmers arrived and they had cattle and they started clearing the forests. Now, people often think that they probably cleared the forests by cutting them down, and there may have been a bit of that. But I think it would have been extremely difficult to clear a forest with stone axes. So my thinking is more along the lines that one of the things that cattle and sheep and goats do, all livestock, what they do is they eat all of the plants that are growing at kind of ground level or just above. And that includes small trees, tree seedlings, as they're called. And if a seedling gets eaten, it dies and it doesn't grow into a big tree. Whereas if it wasn't eaten, it has the possibility of growing into a massive big oak tree over 100 years or whatever, and then living for another few hundred years. Now, if you have grazing animals like cattle and goats and sheep that are preventing that from happening for long enough, the forest will die out because it's not reproducing itself. And as the older trees get old and die, and there's nothing to replace them, the forest just fades away, essentially.
So what do you already know? Let's have a look. You've got 3 questions here. You've got a minute to answer them. Have a discussion in your group. The first one you have to guess. The other 2, you've got some options. But I just want to differentiate 2 things for you. One is what percentage of Ireland used to be covered in native woodland before we arrived. And 2, when I talk about question 3, a plantation, I'm talking about non-native woodlands. So trees that shouldn't be here in Ireland, that haven't evolved to be here. Managed woodlands like Coillte woodlands. Okay, 1 minute, off you go. Keep an eye on the bar at the bottom. Just over halfway. About 10 seconds left. Okay, right. Let's have a look and see if you got them right. So, question 1. What percentage of Ireland used to be covered in native woodland? Over 80%. Question 2. What percentage of Ireland is now covered in native woodland? Only 1%. What percentage of Ireland is covered in plantations? So this is non-native woodland. You wouldn't even call it a forest. And we'll explain why in a little bit. But it's like Coillte forest. About 10%. So we've gone from 80% down to about 11%. So it's a big drop.
People who study these things think that probably about 80% of Ireland was once covered in natural forest, and the rest would have been bogs and other wetlands and wildflower meadows and other types of natural habitat. Now, sadly, natural forest in Ireland is down to only about 1% or maybe a little bit more. So we've only got a tiny fraction left of what we once had. And to make things much worse, unfortunately, most of that those tiny little remnants that we have left are completely wrecked by overgrazing, by deer and goats and other grazing animals, and they're getting taken over, many of them by invasive species like rhododendrons. So being able to kind of go crazy and start to take over vast areas and wipe out the natural habitat of the place. So our native forests are not in a good place right now, unfortunately.
No, they're not. And I think actually what's really interesting is a lot of students that I've been teaching, we have this image of Ireland being so green and kind of eco-friendly, and when you tell people, even adults, in the network, that when we've talked about it, they're really shocked that tree cover in Ireland is 11%, and actually native forest is 1%, and even more concerning to hear you say that little bit of forest that is left is not in a good shape because of invasive species and because of grazers. So Owen talked about invasive species. So what is an invasive species? It's a living thing. We call living things organisms in science, just a fancy word for living thing. That it's a living thing that is not native. So it doesn't belong in that region or country or area. It hasn't evolved to grow there with all the other different species of plants and animals. So why is it a problem? Well, it's a problem because when they're introduced, invasive species are introduced to a new area or find themselves in a new area, they actually cause ecological harm to that area. They can damage native plants and animals that are actually living there. So you have a challenge. There are 6 plants on the board, A, B, C, D, E, and F, and you have to match them to their names. Test out your teachers, see if they know. You've got 30 seconds to do it. Off you go. Ten seconds left. I wonder how you got on. Right, let's have a look. So, the first one was Himalayan honeysuckle. The second was nettles. This is rhododendron. This is silver birch. This is Sitka spruce. And this is Japanese knotweed. Now, I have another challenge for you. You have to pick out the invasive species here. So there's invasive and native species. You've got 1 minute to do it. Off you go. And if you know anything about these invasive species, you can share your knowledge with the other person. You might see signs on the roadsides for some of them. What do those signs usually say? Okay, so nettles are a native species. Silver birch is also a native species. So Himalayan honeysuckle, rhododendron, and Sitka spruce and Japanese knotweed are all invasive species. So they shouldn't be here, and they do cause quite a bit of havoc. So this, I think, is a good time just to talk about who is actually Eoghan Daltun. How does a Dublin man find himself in Cork, and what is your own link to these grazers that you've spoken about?
Well, as you say, I'm from Dublin, but in 2009, I sold my house in Dublin, and the family moved down to the Beara Peninsula in West Cork. We bought a farm down here of 73 acres. Now, a lot of that land was commonage, which is mountain land that you share with other people. But a lot of it, most of the rest was actually rainforest. And now I didn't know it was rainforest at the time. I just saw these absolutely beautiful trees and forest on the land, and I fell in love with it. And that's what attracted me to it. Over time, though, after a few years, I started to realize what it was, that it was actually rainforest. And I was really amazed and delighted to discover that. But unfortunately, the forest was in the same state as I've just outlined to you now, just like most pieces of native Irish forest, it was completely wrecked. So you had feral goats and sika deer were eating all of the native vegetation from about head height down. Almost no vegetation apart from mosses and so on. So all of the trees weren't regenerating. That was the first thing. A whole layer of the forest was completely missing. So a natural forest is full of wildflowers and other very special plants that only grow in the particular conditions created by natural woodland, and they were all just missing. They weren't there. As I said, the whole place was completely stripped bare. So what I did, I applied for a grant under a scheme called the Native Woodland Scheme. That they funded a fence to go around most of the forests to keep the goats and the deer out. Now that took about a year and a half to happen, and in the meantime, I was going around getting rid of the rhododendron and all of the other invasive species in my spare time. Because after a year and a half, the deer and goat fence went up, and they were fenced out, and the whole place absolutely just exploded with life. It was just the most amazing thing to see this. There's been a bit of hard work involved, all right, but it's been the most incredible thing just to see all of this happen, and the way the forest has come back to life as a result of fencing out the goats and deer and getting rid of the rhododendron and other invasive species.
I mean, that's a really kind of hopeful message. I think if we protect nature and leave it be, it can regenerate. So nature is in trouble, and we need to protect it. And in protecting nature, we're actually protecting ourselves. But to protect nature, we need to kind of understand it, and I don't think we do really, because we don't teach you about nature in school enough, at least, or maybe in the right way. But you could prove me wrong. You could see if you can make the connections between all of these photographs that you see. Start off with the insects, work your way around to the flowering trees, the trees that are in flower, and then the trees that are in fruit, the bird and the mammal, and then ending on this plant here. What story can you weave between them? You've got 1 minute to do it. It's basically a little test of your knowledge to see if you know the connections. Off you go, have a chat. Okay, let's have a look. So, the insects, they basically pollinate the flowers and the trees. So the trees, when they're in flower, they provide a source of food for the insects. And in turn, the insects pollinate the flowers. When they pollinate the flowers in the tree, they turn those flowers into fruits. Who eats the fruit? The birds and the mammals. So like the jay and the red squirrel here, they depend on the fruit from trees, amongst other things. And they basically spend a bit of time over the summer and the autumn squirreling away the food, hiding it in different places, digging little depressions in the ground and cover them over, and they'll come back to them later in the winter. But sometimes they don't find everything again, and they forget about some of the places where they've stored their food, and then those seeds germinate and become new trees. So it's a lovely cycle where the trees are providing food for insects and birds and mammals, and then they in turn are basically doing favors for the trees. So turning the flowers into fruits, which have seeds in them, and then these birds and mammals disperse them. I wonder how much of that did you get? Regenerate. So I'm curious, what's the difference between this Irish rainforest or native forest that covers 1% about of Ireland and that other 10% of managed forest, which is we might call a monoculture forest?
Yeah, well, very often you'll hear that in the newspapers or on the TV that about 11% of Ireland is covered in forest. And that's actually completely untrue because if you break down that 11%, it's only about 1% of that is native forest, and the other 10% or so is non-native species planted, just one species altogether in countless rows, and it generally tends to be species like Sitka spruce. So if you go into one of these plantations, I don't like calling them forests, because a forest to me isn't just trees, it's all of the other things that make up the ecosystem, the birds and flowers and fungi and insects and mammals and all of the other things. That if we're talking about a forest, it's not just the trees, it's all of that, and kind of linked together, so it all kind of works as an ecosystem. Now these plantations of Sitka or whatever, generally Sitka, that's the most common, but there are others. They're completely dead inside because there's none of those ecological connections with the flowers and the insects and the other species that make up a native forest. So they're completely lifeless. It's just one species altogether. So if you go into a natural forest like our forest here, you'll see loads of different types of trees, and then all of the other plants and things growing and living there. Whereas one of those plantations, it's just a single species of tree, and they're all planted in countless rows, so it's very monotonous. There's nothing for wildlife there.
Eoghan Daltun, thank you so much for being here and for telling us about your story. I really appreciate it.
My total pleasure, Patrick. Thank you for having me on.
Take care. Thanks a million.
You too. Bye.
What an incredible story of individual action, protecting a small pocket of rainforest in the Beara Peninsula in Cork. If you'd like to know more, check out Eoghan Daltun's book, An Irish Atlantic Rainforest. It would make a really good birthday present or perhaps a Christmas gift. So, to finish up this session, we're going to share with you a story of positive action which highlights that it doesn't matter what age you are. You can take action at any time. This is Violet Ann Shunman. She died at age 97 in the summer of 2021. In 1997, 24 years ago, when Violet was aged 73 years old, she bought a cottage in Waterford. It was on a 1.1 acre plot. In the picture on the left, you can see what it looked like when she bought it. On the right, you can see how she left it when she died. She planted 3 saplings by her own hands when she moved in. In just 24 years, she created a biodiversity heaven, and you can see this as an oasis for wildlife, surrounded by a plantation of Sitka spruce, which we know is no good for nature. There are mature hawthorn trees found all the way down one side of the property. Their May flowers provide lots of food for insects, and these trees are dripping with scarlet berries in autumn and winter, providing lots of food for birds and mammals. She's got beautiful dry stone walls that surround the property, and they provide lots of hiding places and homes for a variety of insects. The amount of plants and microhabitats bring lots of midges, flies, and moths, which in turn attract bats and a host of other wonderful creatures. Violet had also a small pond at the front of the property, which was home to a variety of insects and, of course, frogs. She created a space that was as nourishing for her as it was for wildlife. She helped to address climate change by planting trees which captured carbon from the atmosphere and created a space for wildlife, while most likely improving her own mental health. I've just bought her cottage and I'll continue her inspiring work. I think we could all do with being a bit more like Violet.